Well, I'd like to welcome you all today to a very special event, one that I've certainly been looking forward to for a long time, and that is getting to hear Greg Sarris speak from the heart to us today. I know that he's very concerned with the struggle that Native American people are involved with today, and that we have been involved with for over 500 years. And that is a struggle for the continuity of our cultures, our languages, our religious traditions, our oral traditions. We are an endangered species. And many people indeed have written about this. I know that in the literature there are incredible novels that you can now read to inform yourself about these issues. There are many courses being taught on Native American issues, but always a thing that seems to surface is the idea of Native American identity. Who is Indian? And how do we define that? And usually, I mean, Native Americans are the only people in this country that have to continually prove who they are. The rest of you don't have to do that. So the question is, and I'd like to have you think about this as you're hearing Greg speak, what does it mean to be Indian? I know that those of you who are here are the captive audience, and of course some of my students are here because I told them they'd get extra credit if they came. But nonetheless, it is a burning issue for us in terms of how do we assure our continuity as a people, as the autochthonous people of this nation, of this area, that our cultures will continue. And I think that that is in the hands of people like Greg and others who are working so diligently in a system which basically, I always tell my students, the system is still isn't ready for Indians to be present, and certainly not at the podium. So you can tell by the number of people in this university, the fact that there's only one Native American professor on campus. That says something today. In spite of all the rhetoric, in spite of all the efforts that we have made in the past to change those statistics, it is still a fact that we are considered an endangered species. Now, among ourselves, we don't think of it that way. We think about, well, what are our issues? And recently, I was talking to one of the medicine men on my own reservation in Mescalero, Apache in New Mexico. And I said to him, well, you know, this struggle for the continuity of our culture it's really fragile, and it's a very difficult struggle. How do we translate what you have taught me? How do I translate that into something that makes sense at the university? And he said, well, how would you translate it to make sense here on the reservation? And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, there aren't any more Mescalero Apaches. Just look at all the people here. They're not behaving, they're not living like Apaches. They're living on the reservation, yes, and they are identified as Mescalero Apache people. But the fact remains that we have been so assimilated into mainstream culture that we now crave, you know, white sugar, white flour, white lard, and white everything. And we see this among the youth. And it's very troubling for those of us who are working to change the image, to recognize that the struggle is still alive and well, and that we have a lot of work to do, and that we're all hell-bent on training students as fast and as furiously as we can to take up some of these responsibilities. Greg is one of those people. Not only is he recognized as a writer and working in film and many genres of his writing, I'm continually impressed about how much he produces, but more importantly, how hard he has worked with his own people in gaining recognition, in questions of Indian identity. How do we help the young people who are following us, who will be the carriers of these traditions into the future? It is a very, very complex issue, and it's different on every one of our nations. We have different languages, we have different cultures, we have different land bases, and we have many, many different concerns in terms of how to preserve the land base. Without land, it is very difficult for us to be Indian. because we are so interrelated with the land, with the bioecology of our area, that we have responsibilities for caring for plants, for caring for the earth, for caring for the ocean here, and the Chumash people working so hard to raise consciousness about their interconnectedness with the natural universe. Greg's work, I think, exemplifies that concern, not only for the people themselves, but also for the preservation of the different genres involved with the literature of each of these traditions. And there's no such thing as American Indian literature. There are American Indian literatures. Every culture has its own way. Greg has worked admirably, I believe, in translating the teachings of elders that he has worked with, who talked to him, who presented him with oral tradition, and then in the transposing of that into written tradition, which makes sense not only to Native people today, but also to mainstream society. Those of us working in education always feel that, well, we don't have to just educate the Indian students, and in my classes certainly they're open to all students, in that I feel we need to educate mainstream society, because where would you have learned about it unless you lived near a reservation or were raised near an Indian community or somehow were connected with indigenous peoples in your past. This is a very major issue for us because so many of our wise elders are dying, and along with them often goes the language, and in many cases, an entire ceremonial complex that is critical to our survival. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you someone who has worked on all of the issues that I've just mentioned, and in probably many more that I don't know about, because there are so few of us doing this kind of work today, and I see Greg as an excellent example of that. Help me to welcome him, please. When Greg is finished, I have a few announcements to make to you that Roman has asked me to communicate to you.
Thank you, Inez.
Thank you.
I would like just sitting there listening. I didn't want to do anything. I remember once Mabel McKay, the elder, the medicine woman who raised me once, she was at Stanford, and I brought her to Stanford, and somebody said, the professor gave a long introduction explaining who and what she was and all of that sort of thing, and when he finally said, okay, now Mabel, would you come up and talk, she came up to the microphone and she looked out to the audience and said, okay, now do you have any questions? Our elders are very wise and smart and very clever. I wanted to talk about a few different things today. One of the first things I want to talk about is a little bit of who my people, where I come from, and lead into the writing and the other things I do. I never grew up thinking I would be a writer. I was basically sort of an angry, stupid young kid. But the thing that saved me, in fact, and always kept me thinking, was my experience with Mabel McKay, the medicine doctor, and Essie Parrish, the other doctor from my area. I can always remember them shocking me, making me aware that there was a world much bigger than myself, something more important. I remember once when I was 19 years old, I was home from college, and Mabel asked me to drive her up to the reservation. Now, this is in Marin and Sonoma County, for those of you who, I don't know if you're familiar with that area, but Highway 1 up there, like from Jenner, Bodega Bay, all the way up to Stewart's Point to the reservation, you know what that's like? When it's foggy at night? Okay, you're 19 years old, an old woman asks you to drive her up to see her friend 30 miles, it's Friday night, you know, you're 19, I did not want to take her up there, I had other things to do, but somehow she talked me into it. And as we were driving up there, she was smoking a cigarette and telling stories, and the fog was so thick I could only go about 5 miles an hour. And finally she's, you know, of course, and I was angry as could be, because, oh, how did I get roped into this? And we got up there, or we were driving along, and Mabel got on, I said, Mabel, this fog's awful. I just feel like turning around and going home. I don't know why I agreed to do this. And she said, oh. And she said, well, I knew this lady that used to have a fog song. And I thought to myself, okay, lady, why don't you sing it? And all of a sudden, she started humming and singing the song, and a tunnel opened up in the fog. We drove 20 miles right up the road, right up to the reservation. We got up there, she put her cigarette out and said, guess a song still works, don't it? Well, shut me up. And that's what I learned so much from the older people, is respect and humility, a notion that there was something much bigger than myself. My father comes from two tribes, the Coastal Pomo group and the Coast Miwok. I am currently the chairperson serving my 5th elected term as the chairman of the Coast Miwok tribe. The Coast Miwok of Marin in southern Sonoma County, we never considered ourselves Miwok or Pomo. I don't know that the Chumash people consider themselves Chumash. Those were names given to us by ethnographers. Linguists came along and said, these are Hokan-speaking peoples, we'll call them all Pomo, and these are Penutian-speaking peoples, and we'll call them all Miwok. We were from whatever village we were from. And in this area here, and in Marin, Lake, and Sonoma counties, there were more Indian people anywhere else north of Mexico pre-contact times. There were more people speaking all the language families found in the New World here. Where I'm from in Marin County, there was villages all around, and the old people used to speak 10 to 15 different languages. Many of those as different as English is from Chinese. People say, how did so many people living so close together, speaking so many different languages, live for 10, 15, 20,000 years with very little warfare? We had skirmishes, of course, but we managed somehow to get along with one another and not destroy the environment. What was that about? And these early ethnographers noticed that the California Indians, unlike the Plains Indians who had organized warfare, right? And of course, the Europeans deemed the Plains Indians as the most sophisticated. Why? They had a form of what Europeans understood best, organized warfare. Right? The California Indians were the dumbest, supposedly, because they didn't have any of that sort of thing. In fact, the missionaries, debated a long time whether or not to missionize us. Unfortunately, they decided yes, but because they weren't sure that we were fully human. And of course, as people say to me, well, you California Indians never really got out of the Stone Age and all of that sort of thing. And I say, well, you Europeans have never figured out how to have peace. So what's important? So how did these people, my people, say the Miwok and the Pomo people in that area, live so closely together? Again, the early ethnographers noticed that we didn't have so-called centralized religions as such. We had a lot of secret societies or cults. And everybody belonged to a secret society, and it was basically the belief you were constantly reminded you didn't know everything about everybody. Everything in nature, rocks, plants, water, a certain place. People always say to me, well, can you tell me where there's sacred places up there? Every square inch was sacred. Every square inch has stories. Certain things may have happened in one place or another, but there's not one place that's more or less sacred than another. No, I'm sorry, I can't isolate. But these people you might have a husband, a wife that would be a member of a secret cult, and you wouldn't even know which cult. There were women's cults, bear cults, all kinds of cults, intertribal cults. Up around Lake County, there was a cave. We've heard many of the stories where women would travel 200-300 miles a night in their skins and find other women in other tribes and bring them back and start to work with them to turn into bears and that sorts of thing. It was a very complex world. I wouldn't go steal your acorns across the river because I don't know what songs you have with those trees. And even if I didn't get caught, those trees, because of their songs and whatnot, which I might not know, could cause poison in me, cancer, bad luck, a heart attack, stroke in somebody in my family. So I didn't do that. You wouldn't do that. You wouldn't rape. You wouldn't attack. If I had to physically attack somebody, and you saw me physically attack somebody, that would indicate to you that I had no songs. I didn't have the bigger power. And if I had no songs and had to resort to physical violence, that would say to you what? Go ahead and kill them and there'll be no repercussions. Physical warfare was considered the lowest form of warfare. The other stuff, which of course, the subtle stuff, which, you know, Europeans have a very hard time understanding subtlety. And the subtle stuff, they didn't see. So it was that way. Now, the early ethnographers, as I was saying, saw us as people whose culture was predicated on black magic and fear. And I say no. We were cultures predicated on respect, constantly reminded that we didn't know everything. As my aunt said to me once about the stories and stuff, she says, you know, white men always, when they have a story, they always ask questions. Us Indians, when we hear a story, when we see a tree, we wonder about it. We wonder about its genealogy. We wonder where it comes from. We ask about its stories, its history, because we don't know. And we're going to spend our life living with it, talking about it, wondering about it. She said, white man is different. He don't want to know, he don't know. You know, our word, the Kashaya Pomo word for the invaders was palachai, which translates to miracles. And I used to ask the old people, why do you call white people miracles? And they said, because when they came and they were killing animals and killing people and chopping down trees, instead of being punished, more of them kept coming. They were miraculous. Of course, all we had to do, what, folks? We're all one. We're all one blood. We're one human family. The white people, it just took 150 years, if you look around here now, to see that it is all coming back on us. Nobody gets away with anything. Look at the cancer. Look at the things that are happening. But those are the things that I kind of remember, and the things that for me were important. Now, among my own people, just a little history. The Spanish, the missions came, established the mission in San Rafael, where my great-great-great-grandmother named Supu was born. Her Christian name was Maria Checa. Checa from the Russians when she escaped. General Vallejo's men captured her when the missions were secularized. In Petaluma, the early Mexicans would take they established an elaborate slave trade system with the men, and then they took the young girls and molested them and raped them in the forts. She escaped, and she walked barefoot. It was amazing. She walked barefoot 50 miles up to Fort Ross. What was going on at Fort Ross? The Russians were there, and they protected the Indians, particularly the Indian women, against the Mexicans because of over territorial dispute. She had 4 children there and then became a mistress for a landowner and had 6 more. And that single woman who escaped and walked 50 miles when she was 12 years old basically regenerated 2 tribes. It's biblical, only this time it's a woman, and we trace ourselves back to which man she had. Today in my tribe we have about 500 people. All of them are the descendants of 13 survivors from a people that were approximately 7,000 at the time of contact. Well, what happened? We became, I don't know if you're aware of this, the first piece of legislation that was enacted in the state of California was called the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, which legalized Indian slavery in this state. Indians became the rightful property of whosever land they were on. That was not repealed until 1868, 3 years after the Civil War. Then we became indentured servants. In the early part of this century, we began being put on little reservations or rancherias. They would designate, the BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Department of Interior, was giving small plots of land to the homeless Indians of California. I love that, the homeless Indians of California. We got 15.5 acres in Grayton by Sebastopol. We were there until 1958, when during the summer in August, any of you from Santa Rosa, that area up there? Okay, remember all the fruit fields, and a long time ago there were the pears and the apples and all of that? Now it's grapes. But in the summer, we're all out working in those fields. There were 3 older men left who weren't working, and the BIA came around with something called the Rancheria Termination Act, where it's an updated version of the Dawes Act, which basically says, we will give you Indians the land in private ownership. And in exchange, it's no longer trust land. You're just like any other citizen. And incidentally, you lose your status as an Indian. Well, these guys weren't literate. They didn't know what was going on. They signed away the land. When they came back and ratified it in 1966, there was only one of them left alive. He got the land. He's lost all but 1 acre in paying taxes. We were disenfranchised. We lost our rights as Indians. And as you know, most Indian people, whatever, as I was saying to Inez earlier, whatever rights we've gotten or benefits have been largely in the last 25 years. Well, in 1991, I started a fight to get our rights back. It was a long battle. In 99, I co-authored a bill with our tribal attorney, had it introduced to Congress. It went nowhere. In 2000, excuse me, this last congressional term, I got Barbara Boxer to sponsor it. It went through the House and the Senate. I had to pull in movie star help, Robert Redford, Barbara Streisand and the bunch, whatever it takes, right? And it went through, and lo and behold, on December 17th, President Clinton signed the bill, and we're restored as federal Indians. The most important thing to remember is that you can do it. You know, I get tired and crabby, and I'm going to talk about the books and the movies and all the other things, and nature if you want. You know, we're always into nature, us Indians. The other thing, I get tired, but I think about what my ancestors went through to put me here, to get me here. And I have the fortune of being able to speak with you and share my life and my history with you. My grandmother cleaned toilets. My great-grandmother was raped in the fields. They didn't have these options, and yet these people endured so that we can get here, just as all of your ancestors have. And we owe it to them to ensure that our lives are worthwhile. How dare us live, any of us live, and somehow waste our lives after what they went through, all of our ancestors, to get us here. We forget that. That's that blindness. That's that sort of thing that I think Inez was alluding to. Somehow there's been this, we've forgotten history. We're in a weird state today, folks. This is the first culture, and I'm talking about American culture in general, this is the first time in the history of humankind where youth is privileged over age. Hollywood, right? Youth is privileged over age. Real dangers there. How are we going to learn? You can't learn from what's new. You can only learn from what's been done. And so if you're constantly looking at the new, you get into an addictive cycle where, gosh, don't look back. You can't learn. It's a dangerous situation. Well, back to the writing. I never thought that, I always, when I was a kid, thought I would be a drug dealer. You know, I sniffed so much glue as a kid that if I hadn't destroyed so much of my brain, you know, after, you know, 2 masters and a PhD from Stanford, 5 books, the movies, full professorship at UCLA, and, you know, tribal leader, can you imagine what I would be doing? I mean, I would have given Einstein a run for his money. But at Stanford, when I began writing these stories for Grand Avenue about my people, the professor said to me, who are these people? Are there people really like this? And of course, we were only an hour and a half away from Stanford, but he was thinking of Indians on Appaloosa horses and, you know, the feathers and chasing buffalo and that sort of thing. He couldn't see us as mixed blood contemporary people who were living amongst you. And it was very daunting. He said, you'll never publish these stories. You'll have no success. Of course, that was the early 80s when they were training us to write those minimalist stories for the New Yorker. Any of you read those stories? You know, about Sally who goes to Martha's Vineyard in the summer, has an epiphany and decides to part her hair on the other side of her head. I mean, are there really people like that? I don't know. But anyway, I didn't know them and I couldn't write about them. So I did what a lot of failed writers do. I became a professor. Once I realized that I wasn't going to starve anymore, I picked up the stories and began writing again. And lo and behold, my publisher, Hyperion, gave me a very lucrative 2-book deal and rejected that professor's last novel. See what happens when you pray? Spirits are with you. A guy named Robert Redford also liked the book, and we went to HBO and made a 3-hour miniseries of the same name, Grand Avenue, which I ended up writing and co-executive producing with him. But that was a battle there too, because constantly they were saying, you know, in Hollywood it's all about motivation. You wouldn't know it by going to a lot of films today, but they say they're concerned about character motivation, what makes character. And this woman, an executive in Redford's office, said, you know, Molly, this mother, she's alcoholic. She has 3 kids from 3 different husbands, and she fights with her older daughter who's having sex with all these people in the neighborhood. I don't understand her. And I said, what don't you understand? She goes, why doesn't she take her daughter to counseling? And I thought, okay, Greg, how are you going to deal with this? And so I thought, okay. And I said to her, Rachel, if a spaceship landed right outside the office here in Santa Monica, and it said Mars in 5 minutes, free, would you get on? And she said, well, no, of course not. And I said, well, why not? She goes, well, I don't know anything about Mars or the spaceships. I don't know. And I said, that's about how much we know about counseling. You know, in Brentwood, remember Hollywood, most of those executives, they've never been out of Brentwood. When they have a problem deciding what fish to buy in the supermarket, they call their counselor. But we deal with it differently. So anyway, the battle was on, and of course they wanted Cher to be in the lead. And could you imagine her, for those of you who've seen my movie, going down the reservation road there in that old station wagon singing Half-Breed? I don't think so. So, of course, I thought, what do? I resort to what I always knew best, gang warfare. I would bring Robert Redford up to my reservation, and I love bringing folks up to the reservation up there, especially people who aren't familiar with Indian reservations. My reservation, the road's beautiful. It's like most other roads going to Indian reservations, full of holes, like, you know, government promises, but you just bounce along up there, and you know, there's redwoods, and you can see people getting very excited because there's redwoods and deer, and any minute they, you know, think an Indian's going to jump out with a bow and arrow. They're in nature, after all. And then they see the junk cars on the side of the road. They go, what's this? I said, we're almost home. Well, I had called my aunts to ask them, in fact, if Robert Redford could come. And of course, my aunties, being in their 60s and like other American women, are very taken by Robert Redford. And I called my one auntie and I said, Auntie, Robert Redford wants to come up to the res. And she said, oh, okay, when? And I said, in a couple days. Now, all of a sudden, the phone dropped. And about 30 seconds later, she picks it up and she says, no, sorry, nephew, can't come in 2 days. I said, well, Auntie, why not? She says, how the hell am I going to lose 100 pounds? Well, you know, our people are big. We never call our women fat. Our women are powerful. And I have many powerful aunties up there. And anyway, in the script, the woman, the lead, originally was what we call traditional contemporary California Indian costume, which is a muumuu, rubber thongs, and pink and purple foam curlers and sunglasses. And this woman happened to always go around with sunglasses with a missing lens. Well, we get home, we get to the reservation, Redford sees the trailers up there, and we go walk in and see my aunts, and lo and behold, folks, there are 3 powerful women in muumuus, rubber thongs, pink and purple foam curlers, and sunglasses with a missing lens. Well, you can imagine Robert Redford looking at this. These eyes are coming out of his head. One eye is coming out, and he's thinking this must be something spiritual, you know. This is the Pomo Indians. This is they're seeing with the inner eye. So I couldn't say to them, oh God, aunties, don't you dare, and I couldn't say to Redford, beware. But I introduced him to each one, and then he gets to my last Auntie Anita, and he turns around and looks at all the food we have piled up on paper. Now, people are always amazed when they come home with me with how much food we have. Pies, tamales, cakes, salads, jellos, acorn, Bambi. We've got it all lined up there. And he's just marveling at all the food. Have you ever been to rich people's homes? I mean, our food's on paper plates. They'll serve you on china, the most incredible silver, and you get a piece of asparagus. You wonder why they're skinny. Those suckers don't eat and they save their money. That's how they're rich. But anyway, he's looking at all that food up there, and my Auntie Anita gets up and kicks him in the butt. Well, now it's probably been a long time since anybody's kicked Robert Redford in the butt. And she puts her hands on her hips and she says, Mr. Redford, do you think we're sitting around here looking like this for nothing? And he says, well, no. And I could see him thinking, what did Greg tell me about the spirituality of the Pomo and Miwok Indians? And he'd go, I'd be very honored, he said, if you would tell me. And she says, Mr. Redford, look close at each one of us. Now, God damn it, which one of us gets the part? They were auditioning. Of course, later on he wanted to go for a walk. Everybody wants to go for a walk on a reservation. It's a ghetto in the woods. I mean, what are you going to see? Dogs, full of fleas and whatever. And my aunt said to him, Mr. Redford, I don't know if that's a good idea. She said, us women up here, we don't get to town much, and we sit in the brush and wait for strange men. He was so frightened he wanted 5 people to escort him to the car when we left. But we got rid of Cher. As my aunt said, take a good look at us. We ain't Cher, we're brown and round. So again, a constant battle of translating not just issues of culture, folks, but lower socioeconomic status that Hollywood didn't know much to do with. So we made the movie, it was successful, and I keep trying to do other things, and moved along. My writing always, whether it's movies or the books, has in some ways to do with what I was talking about earlier. Finding out that you don't know something. And a lot of times for Indian people, and many of us, we're bound by anger, internalized depression, where we've taken in ideas of ourselves that we're not worthy. And until we can see another person, until we can get over that, we won't see another person or begin to understand the mystery. Anger and hatred gets in the way. Blinds us to the bigger picture. So many Indian people are angry at white people or whatever. You can't do that. I'm mixed. My mother was a German Jew, and my father was American Indian and Filipino. We're mixed. We're one people. And that anger, and we can see where it comes from, keeps us blind and keeps us narrow. How do we get over it? There's many ways. But this one book, the last book that I published, a big novel called Watermelon Nights, tried to deal with the different forms of anger and hatred that have plagued my community over the 20th century. It's told from 3 points of view: an older woman, her daughter, and then her grandson, the daughter's son. And each generation had to deal with some form of hatred. The early generations, from around the turn of the century, we had a nationalistic movement here where we hated white people. And in fact, in Lake County, there was often the infanticide of mixed-blood children. And then, of course, later on in the 40s and 50s, Indians were ashamed to be Indian, and white was right. And now there's other things, other forms of hatred. That devil keeps coming in. Homophobia in our communities. All these things that weren't there before. Remember, in the old days, if difference was sacred, the more different you were, rather than condemn it, we wondered about it. Oh, that person has something special. That's what we need to go back to. Saying we don't know. Humility in front of a tree. So many people go out and want to hug trees and jump in the ocean and love the water. How do you know the water of the tree wants your smelly body? Maybe you ought to just say hi to it. I respect you. I don't know you. It's a different thing. But anyway, I'm going to read to finish out here, and then I'll answer some questions from Watermelon Nights. And this is from the point of view of the young boy on the street. He's 20 years old. He has had visions, the power to understand things, but fear, anger, something that's happened to him because of an affair he had, which was very small, is driving him away from the community. And in all of our communities, hatred for those that are different or not like us, we lose something precious. Everything that creation has given us is something that contains all kinds of things. For us Indian people, the landscape was a Bible. It told us everything. And when they chopped down the trees and when they rearranged it, it was like burning our text. We had an oral culture, yes, but each tree had a long story. The elderberry trees, how did we know? And even here in Southern California, there's the red tide, and so we can't eat shellfish certain times. How did we know? The elderberry tree told us, from the time it blooms to the time it drops its fruit, you don't eat shellfish. And scientists, though they can't explain it, say, yes, there is something there. When the red tide comes, these elderberry trees bloom. Well, anyway, this young man is about to leave, and his grandmother won't kiss him goodbye. She wants him to take a message with him. She's plaguing him. And I'll read that section of the novel. His name's Johnny. Grandma didn't let her guard down, not like Dell. She kept tough. Breakfast is always a shower. My one suitcase and 2 cardboard boxes in the truck bed, and she's doing the dishes. She hugged me. She had to, on account of how I went up to her, turned her around, and held her tight. She even followed me halfway to the front door, as far as the kitchen table, but that was it. I was on my own. It was about 1:30. It was also 104 degrees. If yesterday's summer had turned its switch to high, then today it just let the world simmer in the heat. Unbelievable. The air outside pushed, squeezed you into yourself, the way the sun dries a raisin. I checked my radiator to make sure it had enough water. My truck was old after all, and then I left. I turned off Gran onto Presley, heading for the freeway. I drove slow. Things looked the way they looked on Sundays when I was a kid. You could see how the neighborhood fixed itself each day while you was in school, while you missed sitting in a classroom, what you missed. Shadows from Grandma's hollyhocks at 9 in the morning, noon shining on car tops, the penned sheepdog on the front lawn, Auntie Nellie taking her daily walk, and more. It was as if on Sundays, and not Saturdays, but Sundays when everybody was around, that the world slowed down with the weight of all that was in it and let you see every sleeping dog and cat, every kid playing in the street, an old person on a porch, every flower, every rose, as if it was passing you in a parade. Driving down the street, I seen the neighborhood like that because leaving itself made everything stand out clear and present and present itself slow. And like on Sundays when I was a kid, I knowed I wouldn't see things like this for a while. Then I seen the truck, because it was no regular part of this neighborhood, because it was so big, parked near the end of Presley up ahead. And when I focused, I seen the watermelons heaped above the wooden truck walls that held them, heaped in a mountain that peaked near the center of the truck bed. I drove forward, slow still, until I seen the outline and shape of each green beauty. Water on a hot day, sweet watermelon. I thought of Grandma. I parked and grabbed a watermelon off the truck. Why I didn't think about getting caught, I don't know. The large black truck was parked in front of Magdalena's place. Magdalena, who grows giant white calla lilies in her front yard and sings Mexican love songs from her porch with no shame. At 50, she still had many men friends. Probably the truck driver was one of them. But I didn't think about it then. Neither did I think about the 2 teenagers, Vince Green and Jaime Martinez, who watched me from across the street. I held the watermelon next to me on the truck seat and went back to Grandma's. I wouldn't have stayed. I would have turned around and left after I set the watermelon on the kitchen table if it wasn't for the fact that she was finally looking at me. It wasn't her dead serious expression. That could have been a scheme on her part to keep me there an hour longer, maybe a day longer. But her eyes, which I wanted since the first time I told her I was leaving, I had them now. She didn't blink. "What does this mean?" she asked after a minute. "What?" I asked. Standing by the table, she began rolling her fingers over the watermelon's humped green back. Slowly, gently, the little finger, the ring finger, the middle finger, the pointing finger, the thumb. "You mean the watermelon, Grandma?" "Yeah, what does it mean?" "What do you mean?" She looked at me straight on, hard. She said nothing. I sat down opposite her. "You mean like a flower or something? Something like old Uncle?" I said, letting out whatever came to mind. "Yeah," she said. "How's that?" I asked. "You tell me." Then nothing again. Slowly, gently, her fingers tap, tap, tap over the watermelon's humped green back. On and on, almost an hour, and she was still standing all the while looking at me. I started talking then just to break the silence. I figured she had a puzzle, a story she wanted me to piece together. A watermelon is like a flower because it's sweet. It's like old Uncle because you can't really tell what's on the inside, what else it is. It's like nothing. It's not like anything, she said, firm. She looked at me, stopped her tapping for a moment, then started up again. If for no other reason than that I'd given the wrong answer, I felt certain now that she wanted an answer from me. That somehow I'd fallen into a trap she'd set. She was waiting. It occurred to me that she would stand there until midnight or until she fell straight over on top of the table, whichever come first. "Grandma," I said, "don't you think you should sit down?" "Oh, yes," she answered and sat down, like she all of a sudden realized she'd been standing for nearly an hour now. And then, what do you think? She sat and sat, looking at me tapping the watermelon. If she could stand until midnight, she could sit until noon tomorrow, and she would. She wouldn't budge. When I looked at the clock again, it was 5 o'clock. It had been 2 hours. Things was serious. Of course, the notion it was all a scheme on her part kept crossing my mind, but it didn't matter. I knowed me and her was at the place of saying goodbye. We just hadn't said it yet. I waited another hour. Nothing come to me to say. Then I got up. She didn't move and called, and I canceled my motel reservation. Turns out the motel done that for me when I didn't show up by 6. I didn't go back to the kitchen table and Grandma after that. I went to my empty room and laid on the bed, and I fell asleep. When I woke, it was 2 in the morning. It took me half a minute to get my bearings. I didn't know where I was. In the kitchen, I found nothing but that big green watermelon on the table and Grandma's empty chair pulled back. She'd gone to her room and closed the door, but that didn't mean she was getting tired. It didn't mean she'd given up. She was looking at me still. Again, the hot day had pushed itself through the walls. The house was an oven. I went out on the back steps and sat down. It wasn't much cooler. The air was thick, sticky. You didn't breathe it, you swallowed it. I tried to think of an answer for Grandma. I could go in and tell her what I'd come up with, make my peace and leave. I could get to San Francisco in plenty of time to look at that first apartment I'd called about, but nothing come. I was stuck, like the hot, sticky air had sealed shut all the passageways inside my brain. Then the voices. Next door, the neighbors carrying on in Spanish. They was someplace near the front of their house, maybe on the porch, talking away, laughing. It was like they'd just started talking. They'd been there for some time. It's after 2 in the morning, I thought. What are they doing up so late? It's a work night. And then I heard other voices, fainter, yes, but even the sound of a radio, as if the neighbors' chattering Spanish was a thread, a piece of stitchwork connecting me to all of the other voices in the neighborhood. I got up and walked along the side of the house to the front yard. The honeysuckle on the fence smelled thick and sweet like perfume on a perspiring woman. And at the end of the path, I looked over the fence and seen them, the Ochoas, folks young and old, parents and kids, relatives, crowded on the porch, packed together on the steps. I glanced up and down the street and seen people everywhere there too, and lights and open doors. I focused and couldn't believe my eyes. Like the Ochoas, they was all eating watermelons. I stepped out into the street and started walking. Folks was out everywhere talking to one another. They leaned against cars, talked over fences, gathered in circles in kitchen chairs on their front lawns. It was like after a power failure or an earthquake. Only there was no disaster. They was happy, peaceful, spitting seeds and talking between bites of the watermelon that dripped from their hands and down their faces. Gnawed clean rinds was in the gutters and in piles below porch steps, and still people was eating. Them that seen me waved and hollered hello. I seen them who they was, but at the same time didn't. Nothing registered. I walked and walked, gone around the block and up and down the streets of the neighborhood. Everywhere it was the same. The world felt inside out. The place of my dreams, which I just woke from, made more sense still than the here and now before me. I would have floated, kept on this way, if Auntie Molly hadn't reined me in. "Johnny," she called. "Johnny," she said again and again until I stopped, realizing I was in the middle of the street, smack in front of her house. "Damn it, can't you see who I am, fool?" she hollered. But she wasn't mad. She was playful, asking me to wake up and recognize her and sit the hell down on her steps for a visit. I felt dumb, which meant I was back in touch with things. "Jesus," she said as I made my way to her, "if I didn't know better, I'd say you was drunk." "I ain't," I said. "Or had too much watermelon," she said, holding up her half-eaten sliver of melon for me to see. She was on the top step, and I sat just below her. Look around," she said, gesturing with her sliver of melon again, pointing up and down the street. "Son of a bitch, place has gone crazy." Behind her, through the open door, I seen Alice and the 2 boys sitting on the couch, eating big squares of melon with silver forks. Watermelon at 3 or 4 in the morning and a stupid TV movie. But oh well. I looked at Molly. She was sober and clear, like Alice had said earlier. Her small black eyes was sad. They always would be. But they was wide open with the street lights and all the world in front of her fixed within them. She bit into the watermelon and smiled like she'd just kissed a lover, then spit a mouthful of seeds to her side and laughed. "Them boys done a good thing," she said. "Who?" I asked. Vince Green and Jaime Martinez, she answered. They started this whole thing. She was holding up her 3/4 eaten watermelon again. They got the idea and then everybody started in. Didn't you know? Yeah, I said, seeing a story of what had happened. I laughed to myself. Then Molly brought the watermelon she was gesturing with close to her face, just inches from her lips and nose. Balancing it upright in the palms of both hands, she studied it for a moment, taking it in with all of her senses. You know what this is, she said, turning her head just a notch to see me? It's kindness. It's kindness them kids done. And then she bit full into the melon again. Funny how a mind works. I seen this, Molly weaving baskets with Auntie Nellie. My mind flipped and made no sense before, and then let me see as plain as the shirt on my back what I could say to Grandma. Lightning struck, and only after I was hit and come to did I know what happened. Bingo, each letter was covered with a chip. I couldn't tell myself then how I knowed so thorough that what Auntie Molly said was true. My answer for Grandma. It didn't present itself in pictures or maps with connecting lines. It settled in my body like peace. Thank you. Thank you. I'll ask any questions. I'll answer any questions, or ask whatever you'd like. Now, I always love talking to people because I never really know what such a broad audience has in mind or what I can do. I think I'm on till 5, so we've got about 5 minutes or so, and I'm willing to stay longer. I know somebody go, yes?
Well, I just want to say I teach your book, Grand Avenue, in my class, and I really like it. It's a wonderful book. And I had 2
Thank you.
I was wondering if you ever teach your own writings, and if you do, how do you handle that? And the other question was, one thing I think that differentiates your writing from a lot of the other Native American literature that I teach in classes, the urban landscape. And I was wondering if you could say anything about if there's any distinction in your mind between like an urban landscape and a natural, quote-unquote, natural landscape in terms of the sacredness of it.
Okay. Did everybody hear the question? Okay.
Greg, could you repeat the question? And
Yes, I'll be glad to repeat the question.
Should others have questions, please use the microphone. Since
There are 2 questions, and correct me if I misrepresent you. The first question is, do you ever teach your books, and how do you teach your own books? Kind of an embarrassing question, but I've got an answer. Excuse me. And the second question was one of the things that distinguishes my books, I assume you were saying from a lot of the other American Indian literatures, is that so much of my stories and my literature is set in urban areas. Well, let me go that question first. Today, 65 to 70% of American Indians live in urban areas. In fact, Los Angeles and the San Francisco Bay Area have the densest urban Indian populations of anywhere in this country. So I didn't grow up on a reservation. I grew up in Grand Avenue in an urban area. And I wrote what I knew. And the question is, for so many Indian people, we become strangers in our homeland. And never is that more clear than in settings in urban areas. And we're poor, so we're often in neighborhoods that are racially mixed, lower income neighborhoods, and we're mixing with other people. But American Indians, particularly here in California, have mixed with other people since contact, since those Russians at Fort Ross, who brought in our women to live with their Koniag and Aleut workers and with their Lower Russian workers. We've been, in our blood and in our stories and our histories, barometers of contact. We're always in the mix. So how does back to sort of the question that Inez was raised earlier, how do we survive? What survives? What keeps us as a people as we mix and move in time? As we do, we don't stop. You know, that whole notion of ethnicity and culture as something fixed in a box is dangerous. Identity and culture is always dynamic. It always was and it always will be. But what survives? And so I've always been really concerned with what I know. How have our values and who we are endured wherever we are, and how we keep going? What is it that keeps us going? And in Grand Avenue, the fact that that young woman can come together with an older woman in a very racially mixed neighborhood And notice, in Grand Avenue, she weaves a pattern in a basket that is a new pattern, a sunflower seed that we didn't have. But she's changing, and it's good. It's still that whole ancient aesthetic and ethic of kindness, of wanting to help, of community. As long as that's there, we can start hearing those stories. Those spirits will start speaking again. Okay, and so that's why I put it in the urban area. The other thing I noticed that so many colleges and places are teaching Grand Avenue. The books had a huge renaissance. I think a lot of it also has to do with the notion that it dispels a lot of the stereotypes of Indian people. Here you've got Indian people mixed with Mexicans, Filipinos, Anglos, all interacting. And I remember a crazy guy, an advisor, when I was up at Sundance, said to me, "I didn't know Indians interacted with blacks." Right, we live in a tree and never come out, you know. So I wanted to do that, and I think that's one of the reasons the book has had such a renaissance, even since the movie, even more so lately, because so many of our young people are grappling with the same issues of being racially mixed, and what constitutes finally culture? Is it blood? Those kinds of questions, and I think the book touches on a lot of that, as it certainly does, as it does in Watermelon Nights. Now, to answer your first question, I generally don't teach my books because I feel it's kind of vain, and I always kind of think professors trying to sell their own books. I do teach the Mabel McKay book. I'll tell you why, when I teach graduate seminars in particular. I teach the Mabel McKay book because I think it's a good antithesis to Black Elk Speaks. Okay, Black Elk Speaks, the most popular book, which was greatly edited by an editor who created this mystical figure that everybody loved. And I think Mabel McKay, when I'm trying to deal with her and figure out this woman, she's mystery, she's spirit. You can never figure it out or frame it. You can interact with it. And what my book became is the story of me trying to get Mabel's life, the story of her life, and in the process being healed in my own. And the mystery remains. Okay, so I teach that book for that reason, because I don't know of another one like it that's a response in some ways to the Black Elk Speaks and the other so-called popular Indian autobiographies. Yes? Maybe you should use the mic because don't be shy.
Thank you for doing a good job with your people as a tribal chairman. I appreciate that. But I wanted to ask, because there are so many, I hear of stories where tribal chairmen take these political positions and are leaders for their people, and then something happens, and they start out with a good thought or wanting good things for their people, and something happens and it changes, and it turns out that they embezzle money or something negative happens. Why would you think something like that would happen?
If you all heard the question, many times tribal chairs and political issues, great ideals bring us together with the tribe and want us to lead, but then you get money and there becomes embezzling and all that kind of thing, and there's struggles in families at casinos in many ways. There's a lot of the rancherias and reservations that have casinos, the families start fighting and what have you. I would say greed and those other kinds of things come into play. Also the play by investors who try to get certain leaders to do certain things. I only have 1 year left in my term, and I'm going to help us get set up. Our office is running. Get us set up, and then I'm going to step down. I've done what I can. But you're all invited. On February 17th, we're having a big celebration up there at Kuliloko in the Roundhouse, and I'm going to give a speech about this very thing to my people. Where are you going to go now? Now's the test. Now it really is going to see who we are. This is an opportunity for us not just to reclaim or become empowered with health benefits, housing benefits, and education benefits, but in the process to reclaim our souls and our spiritual legacy. Is it going to be that, or are we going to keep that internalized white man situation where we're killing ourselves? You know what's destroying so many communities today, not just Indian communities? that internalized oppression, where now, notice, we're killing each other in the barrios, on the reservations. And I always say to the young people, now that it's no longer legal for people to kill us, rape us, hang us, and do all of that, drug us and feed us with alcohol, why are we doing it to each other? We're finishing the white man's work for him. And I don't mean all white people, not white as a color, folks, but that spirit of destruction that some people bought into, both white and then finally now Indian. It's a disease. And so I'm going to say to my people, now's the biggest test we've ever had. Now that we have the chance, what are you going to do? And I'm going back to more of my writing and that sort of thing, and I'm going to see us get situated. I promised that I would get us here, and I did. And now, and it's been very hard for me because my tribe's up there and I live in Los Angeles and flying back and forth in phone bills. But and there's already bickering saying, you know, what do we need Greg for now? And how many, as I was telling Inez and Monique earlier, how many times over the last 10 years on the first Saturday of every month when I'd fly up there did I face a room of 10 people? But once we were restored, after December 27th, our first meeting, there were 410 people. And they were all saying, now we've got to get per capita sharing in the tribal constitution and all this kind of stuff. And I'm going, money, 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 money. What happened to the legacy? And isn't it sad? We're the descendants of 13 survivors. We're all related. Our grandparents are up there going to watch us act horribly. We can't do that. We have the opportunity to not just now, to fulfill prophecy. Prophecy in my tribe, which was at the end of the world when things were really bad, people were going to come back looking at the Indians for a way to live. Now we have the opportunity to teach that. Are we, or are we going to become greedy and continue the destruction? I don't know the answer. Other questions or answers? I can't see everybody real well. Everybody's thinking deep. Well, that's good. People, thank you. I'll be around afterwards. I think there was books or something to sign. If you were embarrassed and didn't want to ask something in public, I'll be sitting up here. I know Inez has some announcements. And thank you for hearing me, and thank you for caring. God bless.